What if your shadow self is not your darkness? What if the part of you that you have been taught to fear, suppress, analyze, and integrate is not the enemy at all? Most people today hear the phrase shadow self and immediately think of psychology, repressed emotions, hidden wounds, the darker corners of the personality, the anger you do not admit, the fear you bury, and the desires you pretend are not there. And in the modern world, this idea is almost always traced back to one 20th century psychologist. But what if that is only the surface? What if, long before modern psychology gave the shadow a name, the ancient Gnostics were already pointing towards something deeper? Not just the unconscious mind, not just hidden trauma, or just the rejected parts of the personality, but a false self, a constructed identity, a mask formed inside the world of illusion, and beneath that mask, something eternal that the world had taught you to forget. Because through a Gnostic lens, your shadow is not simply the dark side of who you are. It's the place where the divine spark lies embedded, hidden in fear, conditioning, survival, and the story the world gave you before you were old enough to question it. In this video, we'll go beyond the modern explanation of the shadow self and explore its deeper meaning through a Gnostic perspective. We'll look at the false identity, the Demiurge's role in unconsciousness, and the inner forces that keep you trapped in reaction and forgetting. Because once you see the full picture of what your shadow really is, you may no longer see it as just a word used to describe the darker side of your personality. You may begin to see it as a hidden doorway, not something to destroy or to worship, but something that has been waiting to be fully understood. Because what you refuse to bring forth does not disappear, it waits. And what waits buried inside the shadow may be the very thing that transforms you. To understand the shadow self through Gnostic eyes, we have to go back long before modern psychology, to the first centuries of the Common Era, when mystical schools were forming around the edges of early Christianity. They did not all agree, they did not all use the same symbols, but at the core of many Gnostic schools was the same idea, that we are not merely creatures of this world. The Gnostics called this the divine spark, a fragment of higher reality buried inside the human being, hidden beneath ignorance, covered by false identity, and trapped inside a world that constantly teaches you to look outward instead of inward. And this is where the Gnostic vision diverges sharply from ordinary religion. For most religious systems, the human problem is sin, and the answer is forgiveness. But the Gnostics saw the human condition differently. The deepest problem was not guilt or sin. It was simply ignorance, not stupidity, but spiritual amnesia. You have forgotten what you are. You've mistaken the mask for the face and the conditioned self for the eternal spark beneath it. This is why self-knowledge was so central to the Gnostic path, not in the shallow modern sense of knowing your preferences or personality type, but a deeper and more profound self-knowledge, the direct recognition of what in you is real and what in you was built by the external world. The Gospel of Thomas expresses this with startling clarity in saying 70, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is not ordinary religious language. It is not asking you to believe harder. It's pointing towards something hidden inside you that must be brought into awareness, or it will rule you from the darkness. And here we begin to see the ancient root of what modern people now call the shadow, because what remains hidden inside you does not stay passive or dormant. It shapes your fears, builds identities, reacts before you can think, and speaks through your wounds while calling itself me. The Gnostics did not describe this clinically. They described it mythically and cosmologically. They spoke of the Demiurge, the ignorant creator who mistakes himself for the highest God. They spoke of the Archons, rulers and forces that keep consciousness bound to the lower world. And also, they spoke of the material realm as a place of forgetting, where the soul becomes entangled in forms, names, bodies, and illusions. To modern ears, This can sound like strange ancient mythology, but what if it was also a blueprint for what later teachers would describe in psychological language? What if the Demiurge is not only a cosmic figure, but the image of the false self, the part of you that claims authority because it cannot see anything above it? And what if the Archons are not only outer powers, but inner patterns of shame, fear, pride, comparison, and spiritual sleep? This is where the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung enters the story, but not as the origin. He gave modern psychological language to patterns the Gnostics had already explored centuries before him through myth and self-knowledge. Through a Gnostic lens, Jung's work becomes a modern echo of an older spiritual map. Long before modern spiritual teachers gave these ideas new names, the Gnostics were already asking the deeper questions. Who are you beneath the identity this world created? And what happens if you never find out? Because the answer was never hidden in spiritual self-help language. It was buried in the question the Gnostics never stopped asking. What part of you is real? So what exactly is the shadow self? It's not simply your dark side, anger, jealousy, fear, or the parts of yourself you don't like to admit. Those things may appear in the shadow, but they are not the deepest layer of it. The deeper layer is the false self that forms around the divine spark. Imagine a flame sealed inside layers of stone. The flame is still there, it's not gone out. But over time, the stone becomes so thick that the person carrying it forgets there was ever a flame inside at all. This is the Gnostic condition. The divine spark is present, but compressed and encoded beneath layers of identity. And around it, the world builds a substitute self, a name, a role, a survival pattern, and a collection of wounds, a way of being that once protected you, but eventually became a prison. This is why the shadow self is so easily misunderstood. Most people imagine the shadow as a monster hiding inside them, but from a Gnostic perspective, the real danger is not that you have darkness within you. It's that you mistake the constructed self for who you truly are. You say, this is just who I am. But is it? Or is it who you became in order to survive inside a world that never taught you what you actually were? This is what the Gnostics call ignorance. Not ignorance because you are foolish, but because you are asleep to your own origin. You may know how to function in the world, but still not know what in you is real. Because the false self can become extraordinarily convincing. It can even become spiritual, quoting sacred texts, talking about awakening and building an identity around being conscious or chosen. But if it is still driven by fear, comparison, or the need to be seen, it is still part of the same shadow structure. The shadow does not always appear as darkness. Sometimes it appears as the image you're most desperate to protect. And here, the Gnostic myth almost becomes a mirror. The Demiurge looks upon his creation and declares, I am God, and there is no other. But his certainty is not wisdom, it's blindness. He does not know what stands above him. He mistakes limitation for totality. And this is exactly what the false self does inside you. It looks at your body, your wounds, your memories, and says, this is all I am. There is nothing beyond this. But the divine spark remains beneath it, quiet, waiting, because truth does not need to perform, it simply is. And the shadow grows wherever that truth is not allowed to enter awareness, not because the shadow is evil, but because whatever is cut off from consciousness becomes distorted. A wound you refuse to feel becomes a reaction. A fear you refuse to question becomes a belief, and a role you refuse to release becomes a cage. This is why the Gospel of Thomas does not say, if you destroy what is within you, you will be saved. It says, if you bring forth what is within you, because what is hidden has to be seen before it can be transformed. But here is the deeper Gnostic twist. What you bring forth is not only pain, it's not only trauma or darkness. At the deepest level, it's the spark that has been buried underneath all of it, the light trapped inside the wound, the real self buried beneath the mask. So your shadow is not the opposite of your awakening. It may be the doorway into it, but only if you stop identifying with it only if you are willing to ask one question that the world has trained you never to ask. What part of me was built by the world, and what part of me was here before the world named me? If the shadow is the false self forming around the divine spark, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who taught you to become false? This is where the Archons enter the story. In Gnostic mythology, the Archons are rulers of the lower realm, forces that keep consciousness bound to the surface, anchored to fear and reaction. But read through an inner lens, they're not only cosmic beings, they are patterns and voices inside the false self that keep you asleep. The voice that says you are your past, you must prove yourself, you are nothing more than the body. These are not just thoughts, they're little rulers. Every time you obey them unconsciously, a part of your awareness is handed over. This is why the shadow self cannot be understood only as darkness. Darkness is too simple a word for what is actually happening, because it suggests something separate from you, something you could cut away. But the shadow is far more subtle than that. It can even appear as protection, ambition, charm, spiritual superiority, and even as the identity of someone working on themselves. Because the false self does not care what costume it wears, it only cares that you keep identifying with it. This is where some modern interpretations of shadow work drift away from the Gnostic path entirely. They say, embrace your darkness, balance light and shadow, become whole by integrating both sides. And psychologically, there may be some truth in that framing. But the Gnostic vision is more precise. The Gnostics were not trying to balance light and darkness inside the material world. They were trying to awaken the part of the human being that comes from beyond the entire system of opposites, beyond light and dark as this realm understands them, beyond reward and punishment, beyond shame, pride, and the endless pendulum of identity itself. Because in the Gnostic view, this lower world is structured through division, spirit and matter, light and darkness, life and death. The Demiurge rules through polarity, because polarity is the architecture of his realm, and the soul spends its life trying to become whole inside a system built on division in the first place. But what if wholeness cannot be found by perfecting the divided self? What if wholeness begins when you remember the part of you that was never divided? Because your shadow is not something to romanticize, it's not a sacred darkness to worship, but it is also not an enemy to destroy. It's simply a signal showing you where the spark has been buried, where a false ruler has taken the throne. And inside you, the false self behaves like a small demiurge, ignorant not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks remembrance. It cannot see what stands above it, so it mistakes itself for the highest authority. It says, I must control, I decide who you are. But it is not the highest self, it is a ruler born from forgetting. And the more unconscious it remains, the more it builds a world of fear and separation, and demands that you stay inside it. So the Gnostic path is not about becoming obsessed with your shadow. It's about seeing through the authority it had once claimed. When anger arises, the question is not, how do I express this? It is what false self is being defended. When fear arises, it is not, how do I calm this? It is what identity believes it is under threat. When shame arises, it is not, how do I remove this? It's who taught me this mask was all I am. This is where gnosis begins, not as belief, but as direct recognition. The moment you see the false self for what it truly is, the moment the inner demiurge loses its throne, and the spark begins to breathe again, because your shadow was never just something you had to integrate. It was simply the hidden chamber where your forgotten light was waiting to be remembered. So how do you begin to face the shadow as the Gnostics would have understood it? Not by simply recognizing your darkness, but by seeing what lies buried beneath it. Because the false self survives through unconscious agreement. It needs you to believe every thought it produces, to react to every wound as if the wound is who you are, to defend every mask as if removing it would mean certain death. The moment any of that begins to be observed, rather than obeyed, the structure begins to dissolve. This is why the most important question in the entire Gnostic tradition is not how do I fix myself, it is what part of me is speaking right now. Is this the divine spark, or the self that was built around the wound? Is this the eternal, or the conditioned? Is this me, or the inheritance the world handed me before I was old enough to refuse it? The moment that question is genuinely asked, something shifts. Not because you have done anything dramatic, but because the observation itself has placed awareness in a different position. Something in you has stepped back and is watching from somewhere much higher than the reaction. And that quiet watcher is closer to the spark than the noise ever was. This is what Gnosis actually looks like in daily life. Not dramatic awakenings, but the slow, patient noticing of when the full self is speaking and when something deeper is. These are not techniques. They're the same questions the Gnostic texts have been pointing toward for nearly 2,000 years. What in you is real, and what in you was built by the world? The mistake most people make with shadow work is turning it into self-obsession, spending all their energy analyzing the wound, naming it, and building an identity around it. But the Gnostic path asks for something deeper. Do not stop at the wound, but look for the spark beneath it. Do not stop at the full self. Ask what it was built to hide. And above all, do not confuse awareness with punishment. You're not bringing things into consciousness so you can hate yourself more clearly. You're bringing them forth because what remains hidden continues to rule you. And what is brought into the light can finally be released from the prison of unconsciousness. The practice, if it can even be called that, is not to become perfect. It's to become less possessed and less ruled by the small demiurge inside the mind that mistakes its limited view for the whole of who you are. Less identified with the constructed self that has been calling itself me since you were born. And little by little, the spark begins to separate from the mask, the real from the inherited, the eternal from the conditioned, the voice from beyond this world, from the echo of the world inside you. And if this has opened something in you, I've created a free ebook called Escaping the Illusion, a Gnostic guide to mastering reality. In it, you'll find practical help with seeing through illusion, understanding the full self, and reconnecting with the divine spark within you. You can download it for free. The link is in the description. So your shadow self is not what most people think it is. It's not simply your dark side or the hidden corner of your personality. It's simply the place where the full self gathers power, because the divine spark has been forgotten. The hidden chamber where fear, shame, desire, and identity have wrapped themselves around something sacred, something quieter, something luminous, and something that was never created by this world. This is why the Gnostic path is not about becoming a better mask. It was about remembering what exists beneath. The world teaches you to build an identity and defend it. The Archons within you teach you to obey fear, pride, and reaction. The small demiurge inside the mind declares, this is all you are. But Gnosis begins the moment you no longer believe them. The moment you see the false self as false, the spell begins to weaken. The moment you ask, what part of me is reacting? Something deeper starts to awaken. The moment you bring forth what is hidden, you begin to understand why Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas said that what is within you can either save you or destroy you. Not because it is evil, but because what remains unconscious becomes the ruler, and what is brought into awareness becomes a doorway. So maybe your shadow was never the enemy. Maybe it was the signal, the buried map, the compressed spark, the very place where your forgotten self has been quietly waiting to be remembered. And maybe the real question is not just how do I acknowledge my shadow? Maybe the real question is what part of me has been hidden for so long that I started calling the hiding place me. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the Gnostic Eye so you never miss our weekly teachings, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because what you are searching for may not be outside you at all. It may be the light within you, waiting to be brought forth.